So as they get older, they'll take the SAT, the ACT, if they want to go to med school, the MCAT, law school, the LSAT, and they'll be competing at like a much grander scale, right? So testing never ends, right? And also, in order to do all of this effectively, right? Like the fact that testing never ends, so it's better to get earlier prep, right? Or just get used to the idea of testing because it's not going away by any means. I think everyone should take any kind of test that comes along their way, just because it's good practice, right? Even if it's not something that you want to go for, it's just good practice to build on skills that you'll need down the line anyway. So that's one big thing that I believe in. The other is the Hunter test acknowledges this on their website, right? They acknowledge that not any one test can capture a student's ability, but it's kind of like this necessary evil to kind of like pick from the students that they can, who they want to join their community, one. And the other thing is that they do certain things to make their tests kind of stand out and not be quite as standardized. So that's where I'm going to get to a point within this kind of presentation later on, where I'll tell you kind of what I've noticed are the hardest things for students to grasp in the time that they prep for the test. Okay, so now that everyone can see my screen, I'm going to start writing on it, highlighting, so you can follow along. Hopefully there's not too much of a lag there. So, regardless of all the tests that I've mentioned, the important thing is to differentiate and know your test, all right? So the first thing is, what is the Hunter College High School test? What is it test for? What's in it? And essentially, why this test? What is the process? So I'll go through what we've known through years, and I'll just build off of that, because with the pandemic and quarantine from 2020 and COVID-19, things have slowly been changing, right? And adjusting. And a lot of that has worked out, as a side result for Hunter, kind of ideally, because the test is not as predictable as before, but there's certain things that will always kind of stay the same. So I want to talk about all of those things as well. So the test is taken by 6th graders for admission into Hunter, which starts in 7th grade. Now, Hunter starts in 7th grade, and 7th grade does not show up in your child's what's known as their transcript, right? To put this lightly, everything that a child does in high school is essentially building towards their resume to go to a great college, or a college where they can have a lot of opportunities, right? So high school is kind of like the time where, the analogy would be like, college is the time where you build your network, you learn the skills you need to know, you get your internships, and then you apply to a job. So high school to college is that at a much smaller scale. And within that, the way Hunter works is 7th grade is not added to your transcript, but 8th grade is. So the benefit with Hunter is that they give you a taste of higher level material at a younger age. So they're very fast paced in that aspect, and they're setting their students up to become more independent critical thinkers at an earlier age. So when, for example, a Hunter acceptance is given, they talk often about experimental learning methods. One of the things that I still think about and try to understand is, in 8th grade, one of our projects for history was to create the agora, right, the meeting place in ancient times, and essentially pick a person and recreate it within ourselves in class for a week. And that was very odd, because that's not the way most schools would teach you how to do things. So it's much more interactive in that aspect. So in terms of who can take the test, right? In years past, the Hunter test has been based off the statewide test scores. So you need to get a certain number percentage. And once that student has reached that, then they're invited to take the test. For students who go to a private school or other schools that don't take those standardized tests, there are other ways of doing it, as well as putting in their grades, letters of recommendation, and the application portal, when it opens on the 24th, will detail all of those things out. So if your child has not taken a statewide test, don't feel like they're counted out or they're not accounted for by any means. This has been the usual trek of doing things in the past. Students will fill out the application around September, October, November, right, around that period. And then the Hunter test is in January. And students are then given the results by the end of February or early March. Now, of course, that has entirely changed since the pandemic. Hosting that many students to take the test is an ordeal. There's, of course, safety concerns, right? And we don't want it to be like a super spreader event. So what has changed is Hunter has been taking the test at different times, but you can see that they're kind of pulling back towards where they used to be. So this year, they've signed the test up for April. So let me just write that down. Last year, it was in the end of May. And the year before that, it was even later. So they're slowly pushing back to that January period. Now, one thing you'll notice is the test is in April, but they announced everything in mid-February. And the test isn't really in April, it's early April, literally the first week. So what they're doing is, one of the things that Hunter doesn't like is the idea of a standardized test. So they're not having students, they don't want students to prepare so early in advance, right? They don't, and this test is something that a lot of students have been working towards for years, right? And it's because it's a little bit different. Because the Hunter test has 3 big sections: math, language arts, and the essay writing section. Now, in terms of math and language arts, those are your multiple choice sections. They're not too different from other sections and other tests. And a lot of the similar skills that the students have, that they would have if they're prepping for those other tests, like the SHSAT, the SAT, or the ACT, they would need. But keep in mind that Hunter is not like those other tests. It's not standardized in that aspect. And what's the reason why? It's because of that essay. I would say overcoming the essay portion of the exam is by far the hardest bit. It is also the hardest bit to teach to students and for them to kind of retain and understand and idealize on their own, because there is a bit of creativity and specifically decision making that's put into it. Now, if we break down the test has 80 multiple choice sections, as well as 1 essay writing portion. And the entirety of the test is 3 hours. They're not broken up into 1-hour sections by any means. Students have a lot more freedom. They get the whole test at once, and then they're supposed to navigate and manage their time. For a lot of students, that in itself is a challenge, right? Managing your time, because other tests that they've taken, like the statewide test, they've been told, like, this is what you have, this is what you have to do. It's on various subjects. You just do one subject, one time for one sitting. So that's the other part that's challenging, right? So keeping track of time is the test taker's job. It's the job of the 6th grader. Does anyone have any questions before I move on? I'm looking at the chat and I'm not seeing anything. If you don't have any questions, please put a thumbs up. That way I know I can just continue. All right, I'm seeing a lot of thumbs up, so I will move on. Thank you so much. So let's get into the nitty gritty of it. So the 50 multiple choice reading comprehension questions and then 30 multiple choice math questions. Now, one thing to keep in mind is both of those together make up 100%. So that means that the reading comprehension is a 50 out of 50, where each question is worth 1 point. But in math, you have 30 questions that are worth 50 points. So what that means is that each math question is actually 5/3 of a whole point. So getting each math question wrong would be more detrimental than getting one reading question wrong for a 1-for-1, just because the math questions are worth a bit more. And then of course they have the essay prompt, and we'll go into that later on. One thing to keep in mind is the test requires students to have above average vocabulary, strong writing and descriptive skills, mental math capabilities. So this is just a list of things that I can imagine the Hunter test writers are looking at when they're picking out students, right? When you're applying as a student, as an applicant, right? So the students who apply to Hunter are usually students who are not quite as challenged in their school, and they're looking for that challenge, right? So you have kind of like the cream of the crop in these other schools throughout the city that are competing for these select number of slots. There are usually about 3,000, but in the last 2-3 years, there have been a few more because they've opened the test up to a bit, a bigger pool of candidates. Of course, with online learning, a lot of more students, there has been, like, let's just be honest, grade inflation across the board. A lot of other students have been having an easier time just doing things at their own pace. And so grades have increased across the board, but maybe standards have been lowered to some extent. Of course, that doesn't mean that there are now more spots open at Hunter. So you might have more people, applying and taking the test, but there's roughly about 150 to 175 seats at Hunter available through the test. Why that many? When I went to Hunter, there were roughly about 200 people per grade. Some people leave at the end of 8th grade. I'm going to address the questions before I move on in just a second. I just want to finish this thought, but please feel free to continue to ask them. If you do ask a question, please send it to the muted co-host, by the way. So what I was saying is essentially they have about 150 to 175 slots, because about 50 students come from the elementary school. When I was at Hunter, my end graduating class was 189, but we started off with a few more. Some people left, their families got jobs somewhere else and they moved away across the country. Some people decided to go to Stuyvesant because they had an older sibling who was already there. So it's easier for their parents to just have both kids in one school. Some students could not keep up. So Hunter has a policy of asking a student, not really quote unquote kicking them out, but asking a student to leave if they can't keep up with the rigor. And even after, a few things have been put into place to support them. So that's kind of why that number is kind of set in stone. And then in terms of going through the exam, right, we'll go through each section. And then I just got a question about, would they make any exception for someone who met one of the criteria but not the other? They would not. It would be an extreme case scenario. You would have to appeal directly to this, to the application team. So I'll go through that in just a bit more as well. So if I'm understanding the question right, I think someone here is asking that if you, for example, met the criteria for math at the statewide level, but not for English, will they let you still sit and take the exam? They most likely will not, unless there were dire consequences, and that it would be kind of like a case-by-case basis where you would need to appeal to the admissions team for just an applicant to be allowed to sit and take the exam. Someone else asked, are we allowed to bring a watch or some type of thing to tell the time? You're allowed to bring a watch as long as it does not make noise. That's the most important thing. So I would refrain from digital watches because usually they have like a beep that goes off for every hour. Or, bringing an analog watch is actually more beneficial for a few reasons I'll even walk down later on. Okay. Are there any other questions before I move on to the specific section by section details? Once again, if there are no questions, please feel free to put your thumbs up. If there are, please type them up into the chat and I'll definitely look at them. Okay, doesn't seem like there are any questions, so I'll just move on ahead. So the first one is language arts section is critical reading. So today I'm gonna actually go over some big giant overview of reading comprehension tips that I teach students when I teach them for Hunter, as well as students when I'm helping them with their LSAT, right? One thing that I've always found helpful is reading comprehension regardless of the test. So there are some basic foundational ways of doing reading comprehension that'll definitely put you a leg up everyone else. And one thing I've learned about learning is based off of habits, right? And habits, good or bad, are hard to break. So it's always better to form good habits rather than bad ones. So I'll teach you all how I would approach the test if I was in sixth grade, if I was learning this for the first time, as well as what habits in reading comprehension have definitely been successful for me. Now, the reading comprehension on the Hunter test is a little bit more advanced than what students are used to in the 5th and 6th grade curriculum. So usually there are passages that are from 7th, 8th, and 9th grade reading. And a lot of those passages also include poetry. And for a lot of students, poetry is the thing that's hard for them to dissect because you have to dissect the figurative language and it's not always the literal meaning. So that's kind of the issue here. Let's see, in terms of understanding the passage, so vocabulary is a very important thing as well. I have a friend who also went to Hunter, and then she's getting her PhD in linguistics. And one of the things that she told me is a certain word in English can have multiple definitions. So a lot of times students who have good vocabulary even understand the primary or secondary definitions of words, but they might not know the tertiary definition. And so that's sometimes what's tested on the test, and they just might not be aware of it. So it's very good to not only increase your vocabulary by reading a lot, but reading from a varied amount of sources, right? I think one thing that I did when I was prepping for the Hunter test, and I say prepping very loosely because when I took the test way back when, 2006, there was not a lot of information about the exam, and it was much more secretive. There was nothing online. The internet was, just forming in itself. So one of the things that I did just to have a better vocabulary and be exposed to different types of words was I would read the New York Times, but specifically the sections I cared about. So I was really interested in astronomy, so I would read about stuff that was happening in space. I love basketball. I'm a lifelong Lakers fan, so I would read the sports section. So those are the things that, just to see it written in a different way at a higher level it definitely helps you to progress your vocabulary in that way. And I also find that students always want to read things that they're naturally interested in rather than things that they're not. So giving them material from a higher difficulty, but not letting it be things that are specific to what they enjoy, makes it much more hard and less palatable for them to take in as well. So that covers kind of the reading section. We'll go more in depth with it when I run through some advice for how to tackle and dissect reading in general. Let me move on to the math section. So we've already covered that the math section has 30 multiple choice questions, but they're worth 50 points. That means that each one is worth about 1 2/3 points. So they're worth a bit more than reading. The math section does not allow the use of a calculator, and it covers a variety of topics, some of which some students have not seen yet in the 6th grade, and they might not even until the end of 7th grade. So it's very important to kind of like take these topics into account and see how the test tests through them, right? Sorry, I just got another question, so I want to address it right away. If a student doesn't qualify because they missed the cutoffs in the state test, can they take another test to qualify? So if they miss the cutoff on the state test, they cannot take another test to qualify, as far as I know. If they did not take a state test at all, right, then what can happen is they can be given a test, a qualification test, just because their school itself doesn't hold the state test, right? So if you go to a private school which doesn't administer the state test, then you can apply, and there's usually a qualifying test beforehand that they have students take. The qualifying test is very similar to, I believe, one of the tests that I mentioned before on the previous page, the Terra Novas. So if you look into that, that's usually what it's very similar to. It's not quite as difficult. I see another question here that I missed that says that if a student had taken the math test, but not the English for their statewide, do they no longer qualify? Well, if they didn't, then that usually means that there was some reason, whether it was medical or something else, that they were unable to sit for that one. So there might be an exception to that. But again, I would wait until the 24th when they open their applications to see what that procedure would look like. Is there a watch in the testing room? So it depends on the room, but usually there's a clock in the middle of the room next to the board where a teacher is writing down how much time that they have left. I've heard from students, because the test is administered in different places. It's administered at the high school itself. It's administered at Hunter College, 2 different buildings within Hunter College. So depending on the building and the setup of the room, it can differ, but time is definitely kept or made aware of, and there usually is a watch in the room itself. Are the ERBs accepted? I'm not entirely sure. I think in the past they were, then there was one year where they weren't. So I think they play it on a year-to-year basis. Are you penalized for incorrect answers? Sorry, I'm just going through questions right now because I see a lot popping up. And I want to make sure I answer all of them. You're not penalized for incorrect answers. So it's not like the old SAT where if you left something blank, you gain 0 points, but if you got it wrong, you lose 1/4 of a point. Yeah, so you're not penalized for incorrect answers. Okay, so I think those are all the questions that I have had waiting around. So I'll kind of direct myself back to the math section. So these topics, by the way, that I've just listed here are just a handful, right? They're only some of the topics that are there, right? Some questions, of course, on the test are straightforward. The test has this trend to start off easy and then get harder or more tricky as the test goes along. It doesn't mean that the last question will always be the hardest, but around the middle, it's kind of up to anyone's discretion, really. What happens is, what makes the Hunter test different is a lot of the test questions are modeled after, what is it? Like, I would say math contest-based questions. They really want you to think outside of the box. I remember when I was first prepping, excuse me, students for the Hunter test, and they had first released like these sample exams that you can see online. One of the things I noticed was, if you take one of those questions, and I had done a lot of digging, they looked really familiar to me. So I pulled out this like 1987 like math contest, and it was almost verbatim the same question. So I looked into who had written that question to see if they had more material, and it ended up being the person who wrote that question in that math contest was actually a Hunter teacher. So they have experience writing these questions, And then they're writing questions based off or inspired off of questions that they've written in the past for math contests. So that's how they stand out. Has an invite gone out to students? Who gets the invite? The current school? Is the test during the school day or evening? Okay, so just to handle that specific question, because there were a few within it, I want to say that the invitation has not gone out to students. There is no longer an invitation process. Now students are asked to apply. So they've said that applications will be open on the 24th, which is the end of this week. And there's a process to check whether or not you qualify to apply. And is the test during the school day or evening? The test has always been during the school day, and that day the student would have to miss for school, or at least miss a portion of it to sit and take the exam. Yeah. All right. I'm going to go back to the math section. So the key thing about the math section that makes it stand out is that context-like questions, which will ask you to think outside the box. Of course, there's some situations where, you know, if you do it the long way, you'll get the answer. So, and we'll explore one of those questions later on today as well. And we'll go through that. In terms of, you know, area, perimeter, and geometry, sometimes they do visual 3D images and like rotating it around. So that kind of visual geometry is the types of questions that they're given. Oftentimes those are spheres. You can think of cubes and them twisting and flipping, very similar to how someone who does Rubik's Cubes would think about it mentally first, kind of morphing the image and visualizing how the twists and turns would have an effect before moving on. All right. So I'm going to move on from the math section now to talk a little bit more about the essay section. And we're going to dive really into the essay section, definitely later through this presentation. And of course, I'm sure there will be a future one later on where it'll just be based off the essay. I wouldn't be surprised. We've done that in the past as well here at Kweller. So on the Hunter test, right, they're asked to write either an essay or an autobiographical piece that demonstrates, and these are the things that have been written in the past: originality, effectiveness, and the use of detail in your writing. Now, the thing is, it's a little bit more complicated than that. The essay is probably the most important part of the test after a certain point. So the way the test is graded is this. We've already talked about the multiple choice. So I'm just going to zoom in here and write some things down. So from the multiple choice, out of 100 points, right, let's say there's about 3,500 students that are sitting to take the exam, right? So from these 3,500 students, let's say 500 students got a score of a 78 or higher. So for that specific year, the 78 is a green light. It is telling you that everyone who got a 78 or higher is in the top 500 of multiple choice scorers. Only these test takers have their essay read. So what does that mean? Once you've made the cutoff, which again changes year by year based off of how that year's specific pool does on the exam, right? Let me give you an example. If the cutoff one year is a 69, right, which is much lower than a 78, that means that that year the test was probably harder and not as many people scored as high, right? If another year the cutoff is an 82, that means that compared to other years, getting an 82 was much easier, so the multiple choice or that year's pool of multiple choice test takers were much stronger. So they're always graded around this 500 number. That has been the cutoff for years in terms of how many essays they're willing to read. So first they gather all the multiple choice scores, they set the cutoff, and then they start reading the essays. From these 500, there is a rubric that the Hunter College High School English and social studies teachers have that they follow in terms of grading. It's usually 2 graders. And if there's a discrepancy within the 2 graders big enough, then there will be a 3rd grader that looks at it that will ultimately score and choose the 175 or 150 students that are picked at the end of the day. So that's how the process goes. They do not take into account whether someone got a 92 or an 80 when they're looking at their essays. The only thing they care about after the cutoff has been met is solely the essay. So at the end, the essay is the only thing that determines whether a student gains admission. That's why the Hunter test is not standardized. Because to teach multiple choice, even though Hunter works against standardizing even their multiple choice section, specifically due to the types of passages they have students tested on, as well as the multiple choice math questions, the key thing that makes them unstandardized is the essay here. Because the essay is something that is harder to teach students to write, And it's usually very different from what they've been doing in school. In school, most students around this level don't write too much creatively, and instead they focus a lot on book reports, right? Or reading something and then writing something back about what they've read. So that's what makes this different, right? This creative writing, this descriptive writing aspect, this personal writing aspect is what makes it different and more difficult for most students. Okay. So this is a pretty big deal and a pretty big knowledge point. So I'll stop here to just see if there are any questions. So I see one, it says, is the cutoff based on the total score or on each subject? It's based off the total score. So to get this 78, right, they're gonna look at your 50 points from reading and your 50 points from math, right? And so your cumulative has to be at least a 78 or above in this example per se. This question usually gets asked, so I'll go ahead and answer it right now. So what's the cutoff usually around, right? So the cutoff is usually around 75 to 80, what I've noticed in the past, somewhere between 70 to 80. So I like students to be in that 80 range to be comfortable. But of course, you're always vying for the highest possible score that you can get. Someone just asked, how do you apply for the test? The application portal isn't open yet. It opens on the 24th. So the end of this week. That's when it'll open. Okay. I don't see any other questions, so I'm going to go ahead and start moving on. Just to give you all a taste of what kind of questions they ask for the essay prompt, right? In years past, and this changes, and this is the other thing that Hunter, as as a school, has been doing to kind of not have these quote unquote trained essay writers, right? They don't like the fact that students are, tutored for their exam or whatnot, right? Do you get an email to fill out the application, or how does that work? You go on their website, and then there's a section within admissions where you can click to apply. Yeah, you don't get an email sent to you. Okay, so sorry, back to the essay. So in years past, right, they have asked something that's related to New York City. Sometimes they've asked personal questions. For example, I remember my essay was write about your everyday superhero. Then in years, they usually had one prompt, and then in 2016, students were asked to choose between two essay choices, and neither of the options were in New York City focused. So I want to stress this, that the essay year by year has been getting more and more unpredictable in terms of what they'll ask, right? So, and there's no required length for the essay, but they give you the amount of length that they give you is what you can write the essay in. So let me explain. They'll give you, let's say, 2 pages, right? And they'll give you lines that are marked out. You can always ask for extra paper, but I would say not for the essay. So what ends up happening is oftentimes this is the space that they give you is the amount of space that you have to write the essay. The reason why this is also important and why your essay can't just go on forever is it's the mark of a good essay writer to be able to write what's asked of them in the space given to them. That's really why, right? You also have to think about timing. If you just focus on the essay, then you won't be able to move forward from there. So there are 2 essay problems. So no, not necessarily, but there could be. Essentially, in the past, students were asked to choose between 2 essay choices, and neither of the options were New York City focused, is what I'm saying. So that means that they were given 2 options, A or B, and they picked one, and that's how they navigated through the test. It is handwritten unless there have been special circumstances where you would have to ask for them to let your child type it for some kind of purpose, right? So it would have to be kind of like mandated, or there has to be a reason behind it. They don't prefer students to be typing up essays. Someone else's question was, so for the cutoff, can you be much stronger in ELA and a bit weaker in math, or vice versa, but still make the cutoff? Of course you can, right? The cutoff number is just the thing that needs to be hit. They don't really look at how it was hit necessarily. Okay, so let me go down. So in terms of scoring and selection, so we've already talked about this a little bit, right? They have 500 scorers, right? They move on to the next round who have their essays looked at, and then approximately 170 is the number I had when I first made this. So about between 150 to 175 students are then selected based off their essay. Hunter also maintains a waitlist pool of about 20 to 30 students. They don't say how those students are ranked, And if an admitted student declines admission from Hunter or they withdraw within the first week, then someone from the waitlist can get off and enter the school. After the first week has gone by, you are no longer going to be considered, even if a student leaves later on. So it's not like in 8th grade, a student left for whatever reason, they moved away, they're going to call someone off the wait list. If you don't hear back within a week of starting Hunter, you will not be admitted into Hunter. That's the way that the waitlist pool works. Okay, any other questions before I move on? Okay, let me move on. So someone asked, apparently this year Hunter increased the eligibility bar to 95 minimum ELA and math grades at school report card from 85 in the previous year. Is that accurate? I'm not entirely sure what the cutoffs have been. I didn't look too much into that onto the website, but whatever is written on the website is going to be what's accurate. Usually they will not have that big of a jump from year to year. It hovers around 90 to 95 from what I recall. 85 seems uncharacteristically low. The other thing to take into account is if they have increased it, it's probably because of grade inflation, which is happening all around the country because of those years of Zoom. So I think that's where it might have happened. Is the child's current school involved in the application process? Usually not. You apply, and unless it's a school that, for example, doesn't administer the statewide exam, and so you need to find some other source of testing, then you may need a letter of recommendation from teachers, but usually the current school is not involved in the application process at all. Should a student write an essay about that clearly discloses their background? I'm not entirely sure what you mean by that, but we'll definitely get into this in just a little bit. I'm going to just go ahead and move on then. So the first thing I want to talk about is the reading comprehension and how to read. So this is usually my most infamous class. When I used to teach the classes at Kweller, this is my first lesson, is teaching kids how to read. And then whenever I work with someone, no matter what standardized test they have to deal with, if that standardized test has reading anywhere within it, this is usually my first lesson. And there's a few reasons behind that. So I learned early on what works and what doesn't work as a continued bit of practice throughout multiple tests that have reading comprehension throughout the years. So I'm going to ask you all a few questions. Please feel free to write in the chat if you think you know the answer, but stay muted. So when you do reading comprehension, there's two sections. There's the reading section, and then there is the essay section. So the question section, sorry. So should you read the questions first or the passage first? What should you read first? So I zoomed in too much so that the answer isn't given away. So should you read the passage first or should you read the questions first? So I'll wait to see a few more people. So I was getting a lot of read the questions first to get an idea. Someone said the passage. A lot of people are saying questions so you know what to look for. Another person said passage. Questions first, questions first. A few more questions first. A lot of cues in the chat. Long passages, read questions first, questions first. Okay, wonderful. So most of you are wrong. And that's good because that means we're all learning something. So I have stayed by this no matter what type of test I've taken. You should always read the passage first, not the questions. And here's the reason why. When students, especially sixth graders, right? Because remember, you're building habits right now, right? This is usually one of their first forays into the standardized testing bit. When you read questions first and then the passage, what you end up doing is you scan the passage to answer that question. And so the easy detailed questions you get right away. You're going to get them right. Nice, awesome, great. Because you're going to see the detail in the passage as you're reading through it. You're like, oh yeah, this was a question. Let me just go back and answer that question. What you fail to get is the questions that ask about the entirety or the context of the passage. Those are the ones you struggle with because you've just been reading for the details, but you don't really have a good idea of the big picture, right? You're not forming connections. So what ends up happening is in order to get those questions right, you end up rereading the passage again. And by that time, you've wasted time that could have been used more efficiently. So my advice to all students whether you're someone sitting for the Hunter test or you're someone who's out of college and studying for their LSAT and doing the reading comprehension for that, is to read the passage first, not the questions. Okay? Read the passage first, not the questions. Now, I cheat a little here. I tell them, don't read, skim. And this skimming is an art in itself, right? The whole reason why you shouldn't read the questions first is because then you'll be hyper-focused on the questions and not the passage as a whole, and then have to reread the passage, which is going to hurt you in the long run, right? So some parents are probably thinking, well, I can do this, why can't my child? Well, one, they're in 6th grade, they don't have as much experience, right? That's one. And two, as they get older and the tests get harder, right? And harder, after a certain point, reading the questions first is going to be more detrimental because the questions are very heavy focus on multiple parts of the passage, not just a singular part. You have to make inferences from multiple different points made in the passage. So for those questions, it becomes even harder and harder to navigate. So I'm about building two things. One is what is probably easiest for them at this age? And two, what's a good habit to have in the long run that they need to build anyway? So now let me explain what skimming means, right? Skimming is you focus on major details and you ignore minor ones. So there's a passage about Angela going to the store to buy a list of items. I don't really care as someone reading it, what are the list of items that she's buying? Because if I ever need to go back and figure out the list of items, I know where to go back to in the passage. What I care about is why did she go to the store in the first place? What is the importance of her buying these things? Is she prepping for a birthday party? Is she prepping to get something else, right? So on and so forth. So that's how you differentiate between what's a major detail and what's a minor one. Oftentimes, when you ask young children to describe a story, they go hyper-focused into tiniest of details, and their story drones on and on and on and on, right? Or on the flip side, they say very few sentences, and you have literally no idea what has happened. That's because at a young age, it's hard for them to decipher what's a major detail or an important one and what's a minor one. So this reinforces this idea, the habit of learning how to skim. Now, as you skim, you should be annotating. What annotating means is you're writing things down in the margin of what you're reading, so you understand what's going on in the story, right? And these notes are only for you. So I always write this. I always say these two things. Your annotations only need to make sense to you, because remember, when someone who's grading your Hunter test is looking at your reading comprehension, they're not looking at your booklet. They're only looking at your Scantron because it's multiple choice. So all they care about at the end of the day is whether or not you got the questions right. And it's done for yourself, not for anyone else, right? So they only need to make sense to you. So for me, I won't write the word happy. I'll just draw a smiley face as my note that someone was happy, right? So you'll often see that these annotations become like hieroglyphics. Two things that are really important as you annotate and you skim and you keep in mind are these two acronyms, DID and KISS. DID stands for dumb it down. And for a lot of parents, KISS means keep it simple, stupid. But for the students, I always say keep it simple and short. In both cases, the it that I'm talking about is the passage itself, right? I always say if you can explain what you read to a 5-year-old, simplify it that much, you're doing a great job. The reason why we do this is because in reading comprehension, your worst enemy is you, the reader. You tend to overcomplicate, overanalyze, and just make it overthink, really, the passage itself and then the questions. So the more simplified you keep things, the easier they become. And you should be doing these annotations paragraph to paragraph, but of course there's an exception. When a paragraph is too long or when a paragraph is too complicated. So the too complicated bit is usually for students who are taking the SAT. I think for the Hunter test, there's usually not a paragraph that's too complicated, but some of the passages we practice from are from the SAT, just to make sure that students get a taste of how difficult a passage could possibly be and still be able to decipher through it. If it's too complicated or it's wordy, then you break it down, right? You block it up into smaller pieces that you can deal with, and you write multiple annotations for it. The next thing is not going to make sense right away, but I'll explain it using an analogy that I always refer to. Predict questions that you already know the answers to. So I'm going to just go off book for a second, and I'm going to say that I'm going to just set up for 2 weeks. So this is week 1, sorry, this is week 1 and this is week 2. And you're all in my class and I'm teaching you all I'm teaching you all about the Civil War, right? So let's say on the Friday of week 2, we have the big test, and Wednesday and Thursday here are days for review. Here I have my lesson, and 2 more lessons. So we have 7 days of lessons, 2 days of review, and then is the test. Okay. If I spend 3 days on the Battle of Gettysburg, and then one of the 2 review days also on the Battle of Gettysburg, what does that tell you as a student? It tells you that the Battle of Gettysburg is really important and it's going to be a major portion of our exam. But I never said that, right? You're making this very logical, very understandable, and smart assumption based off of me doing what? Repetition and emphasis. In that same vein of thought, if you see something that the author is stating over and over again in a passage, there's going to be a question about it. Every single time the author is telling the reader, hey, look, pay attention to this. It's going to be important. There's going to be a question about it. So this is how you're predicting questions that you already know the answers to, because you know where to go back to in the passage to get the answer. So that's why this is really important. This is all of these skills, by the way, that I'm talking about are things you're working on as you read. We haven't even gotten to the questions bit in this T-chart, right? So these are all things you're working on as you read. And these are skills that, like I said, it's all about building habits. You might not be comfortable with right away. This has happened in the past when I work with students for long periods of time. After I first teach them how to do something, they have a hard time with the first 2-3 passages to readapt, right? And that's why I always say habits, good or bad, are hard to break, right? Because they're having to break their old habits of how they did reading comprehension. And then after that, once they get the hang of it, their scores start to skyrocket, and then they maintain that because they've now figured out how to do this. So it's definitely a skill that takes time and patience to work through. The next thing is, as you read, specifically prose, right? Non-fiction writing, fiction writing, you want to pay attention to point of view, especially with dialogue. When they constantly change between dialogue, you want to always make sure you're aware of the point of view, the speaker that's speaking at the moment. So, and these are just some hints to figure out types of point of view. So first person point of view will use words like I and me. Second person will use you and we. And third person will be he, she, they, him, her, them, and so on. And that was just the reading portion of things. And this is universal for all types of reading, poetry included. There's a few extra tips for poetry that I like to add on, but we don't really have the time for that right now. Before I move on to the questions, I just want to see if anyone has any questions based off anything I've said so far. If you don't have any questions, please put a thumbs up so I know to continue, and we'll go from there. Okay, wonderful. I see a lot of thumbs up. I will move on to the question section. So in the question section, here's a few things to keep in mind. Questions, there are all different types, right? There's the inference questions, detail questions, vocabulary and context, main idea, cause and effect, not/except, line number, paragraph questions. The nice thing is, regardless of whatever type of question you may have, all must be answered using passage-based evidence. So let me give you all an example. If I'm just going to see the first name that pops up on my side. If Anne here has read a certain book, like let's say The Kite Runner, and I have not read that book, and we get a passage from that book, she should not have any advantage inherently over me in terms of answering the questions, which means that every single question that's asked has to be clearly deducible, answerable from the passage taken, right, from that book, the excerpt taken. So no matter what, you must be able to back up every one of your answers using passage-based evidence. I've mentioned this before, you are your own worst enemy in reading comprehension, and this is usually due to doubt. I'm sure this has happened to everyone at least once. It still happens to me sometimes. You have A, B, C, D, E. You have 5 choices, and you know it's not A. You're like, B sounds good, but let me check through all the questions. C's not it. You're like, maybe D's it, and then E's not it. And then you go back and forth. Is it B? Is it D? Is it B? Is it D? You mark D, but of course that was wrong, and your initial answer B was correct. Right? I'm sure this has happened to everyone where they picked the wrong, they had the right answer chosen, and then they picked the wrong answer after reviewing. Right? So I just got a question about, do you annotate and read in one pass or do you make two passes? So I annotate and read in one pass. And I'll go through that skill as well in just a little bit of how you're supposed to be doing that quickly and then going straight to the questions after effectively. All right, so let me just go through this. So you are your own worst enemy in reading comprehension due to doubt. And here are some just pieces of advice, right, of how to go through this. So an answer is not correct. So this is when you navigate through your answer choices. An answer is not correct, even if it's true, because it must answer the question being asked. So oftentimes I've had students do this in the past where they'll say, Mo, this answer choice is true. Look, it's in the passage. I'll say, yeah, it's in the passage for sure. But the issue here is it's not answering the question being asked. So you must do due diligence in making sure that the question that the passage is asking is the one being answered. If part of an answer choice is false, the whole answer is wrong, right? If there is, if there's just a little bit of something dirty in a bowl of milk, that entire bowl is no longer good, right? It's the same exact concept. If part of an answer choice is wrong, the entire answer should be crossed out. Now, this part's a little tricky, so I want everyone to pay attention very closely to this one. Extreme answers are almost always wrong. Extreme answers are almost never right. So you'll notice that I highlighted these words because they are key things to understand what's an extreme answer versus what's not, right? Extreme answers are not right because they can be proven wrong easily. So let me give you an example. On the Hunter test, right, or not on the Hunter test, but let's say from the day of my birth, I went to the bank every single Thursday. My parents took me there in a stroller when I was just born. I've been going every single Thursday of my life. Then the statement, Mo goes to the bank every Thursday, is true, right? If it's been happening since birth and I literally gone to the bank every single Thursday, then that statement is true. But if I just miss one Thursday, that statement is forever false. So that's an extreme answer. He always goes to the bank on Thursdays. That's why that's wrong. That, and at its crux, that's the reason why extreme answers are wrong in general. So you'll notice how I said are almost, because there is an exception. The exception is if the passage itself uses the word always or never, if it uses an extreme word. If you're quoting straight from the passage, right, and the passage is not meaning it figuratively, but literally, then that answer choice is going to be right. But that is the one and only exception to this, okay? Next up is when you're stuck between two choices, become hypercritical about the differences between them in wording and context, and use evidence to differentiate between them, right? So back to that example of being stuck between answer choice B and D, I had to literally look at, well, what are they saying that's different? And which one has more evidence to back up the question? Which one is answering the question in a better way, more specifically? That's going to give me the right answer. So that, again, takes skill, and it's a process. The more you do it, the better you get. Getting better at reading comprehension is like working on your muscles, right? You need to do a lot of reps. You need to get in a lot of practice, and the better you become at this. The process in the beginning is slow, and so reading speed is something you need to build, so on and so forth. For vocabulary and context or a line number or paragraph number question, always go read 2 to 3 sentences before the ones mentioned, right? The ones containing the thing that's being quoted, and 2 to 3 lines after. So we've talked about how everything must be answered using passage-based evidence. This vocabulary and context line/paragraph number questions, they tell you where to look. So that's why they're really nice. They tell you exactly where to go and pinpoint the information to find evidence. Whenever possible, try to ignore the answer choices and think of the correct answer in your own words. Then go searching for it in the answer choices. This is probably one of the most helpful skills, but it's one of the hardest ones to master. It depends a lot on confidence, right? So for example, for main idea questions specifically, what I like to do is after I read the passage, I cover all the main idea question, the answer choices with my hand, and I try to go through in my head what I would say is the main idea. Because once you've gotten good at that, you won't let the answer choices distract you from what the right answer is supposed to be. So I'll kind of say that to myself mentally and then go searching for that answer. And then that is the answer that's correct. When doing cause and effect questions, always go direct. So that is oftentimes a little bit difficult for people to understand as well. So I'll go through that. If, for example, sorry, let me just change the stylus here. Okay. So there's a very famous passage that we work with on SHSAT. That's a perfect example for this. So there is a volcano that erupts. Sorry, mind my poor drawing skills. Then it causes a lot of dust to gather in the atmosphere. The dust gathering is blocking the sun's rays. And then over here, it's cold and farmers have no crops. Okay. In the real world, we would say, why do farmers not have any crops? The root of the problem is the volcano explosion, right? The volcano erupting. Now, that's true in the real world, but on the exam, on any standardized test with reading comprehension, the reason why the crops did not flourish or why farmers don't have any crops is because it's cold. So this is what I mean by cause and effect. Always go direct. Just go one step back for reading comprehension. Not/except questions require you to utilize POE. POE stands for process of elimination. So for example, if I have a question where it says A, B, C, and D, which of the following was not in the passage, before I can pick the right answer of B, I have to say A was in lines 4 through 12, C was in line 15, and D was in line 32. And then I can confirm that B was nowhere in the passage. So those are just the majority of the reading comprehension questions and the tricks and tips to navigate through them. All right. Does anyone have any questions? I see a few have popped up. So I think I've answered one of them. Do you annotate and read in one pass, or do you make two passes? I read and annotate in one pass and then go to the questions. I constantly flip back and look back at my annotations to know exactly where to go quickly to make sure I have the right evidence. I'm someone who wants to be fully sure that I got a question right. So oftentimes you'll see me do something like this. Number 7 is B because of line 17. And that way I know it's a quick check, right? One, it gives me confidence that I don't have doubt in this answer because I have evidence. And when I'm doing a quick check, there's a little bit of time remaining. I don't have enough time to reread the entire passage. I can then go back, read line 17 and be like, oh yeah, choice B still makes perfect sense. So that's to answer that question. Someone else had asked, hi, I'm still confused about the application. Do we just apply directly from the Hunter website? Or we will have to wait for the letter, invitation, or email from DOE. There is no email or letter from the DOE. You apply directly through the website. The application portal has not yet opened. It'll open on the 24th. Should we use pre-annotations or just annotate in our own way? You should definitely annotate in your own way. I always believe that as for me, myself, I have built my own way of annotating. I annotate differently when I'm reading something for the SAT versus when I'm doing a Hunter test passage. I annotate differently when I'm doing an LSAT passage. So annotations evolve as you get more familiar with the test and what works for you. And also annotations differ student to student. So I think that's very important to kind of navigate through as well. All right, let me move on to the next one. So here I had a passage. I wanted to go through it originally if we had enough time, but we don't. So I don't want to take up everyone's time. This is a poem. Very similarly, right? I would annotate like each stanza because that's like the paragraph equivalent. I'll show you a little trick that I would normally do. I would analyze the stanza first. You'll notice that right here, right, these are about the same size, but this stanza is a different size. Right away, that alarm bells go off in my head and I'm like, oh, this is going to be an important stanza. Something crucial happens or changes. That's why stanza length changed, right? So once again, like once you're able to decipher through these bits of reading, you can tell right away when something important is happening, right? Without even having read it. Like I know this is going to be an important part of the poem because something changes and there will be questions about that change. And then I wanted to go through some of these questions with y'all, but we really don't have enough time. I still want to talk about math and do due diligence for that, as well as the essay, which I know that there's actually a lot to talk about in how Hunter has been changing that and keeping us and everyone else on their toes about it. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and move on to math. There were 3 math questions here, but we'll probably focus just on the first one because I wanna get to the essay bit as well. So I want to show you all the first question here. This is classic Hunter question. You'll always see some sort of thing like this. So just to give you a taste of what kind of thing yes, I'll go through so someone just asked a question about the essay, so I'll go through that really quickly. Someone asked, can you please walk through how the essay is scored after you are in the top 500 of the multiple choice? What is the weighted score of the essay versus the multiple choice section? So after you are in the top 500 of the multiple choice, it's like your multiple choice score does not exist, right? You are graded solely based off the essay rubric. That rubric is only known to Hunter graders. The Hunter graders are current English and social studies teachers, because those are the two classes where you do the most amount of writing. And I'll walk through what I have seen is a successful Hunter essay, regardless of the prompt, so on and so forth. Okay, I hope that answered your question. All right, so I'm going to go to the reading and then we'll get back to the essays, I promise, and we'll go through them. Oh, sorry, the math, and then we'll go back to the essays. So this question, what is the 143rd digit in the following pattern? So you'll notice the pattern goes 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, so on. So of course, the student can answer this. If you give them enough time, they could write out all 143 digits, count them, and then tell you what the answer is. That is, of course, not the most effective way of doing something, right? So we're here because, this test is time. I remember in 7th grade very clearly, one of the things that makes us the most dominant race, not race, but species in the planet, I remember my 7th grade math teacher telling us this, is our ability to deduce pattern recognition. So early humans realized that there were seasons, and after fall, there would be winter, so you want to stock up on food, and it was key to their survival. So in that crux, right, math is very much based off of pattern recognition to find shortcuts of doing things. So we're going to organize, because organization helps you see patterns better. So I'm going to organize 0 through 9. So 0 through 9. So I'll say these are my numbers, and these are my digits. So they go from 1 through 10, and they are all, and this is number of digits, right? So these are 10 digits, right? Because I went from 0 through 9, because they're all single. Now from 10 to 19, those are 10 numbers, right? But now we have 11 through 30. That's because there are 20 digits, because they're all double. So you'll see these 10 numbers are getting multiplied by 2 because it's double. So 19, this 9 and 19 is my 30th digit. Does everyone see how I'm organizing? So this pattern is going to continue. 20 to 29. Again, that's 10 numbers. Again, that's going to give me 20 digits. And because each of them are double, and this went from 31 to 50. So the 29 is my 50th digit, the 9 in 29. Can everyone see the screen? I'm getting a message that someone cannot. Please let me know if you can see the screen with a thumbs up. Okay. All right, I have double digit thumbs here that say that they can see the screen. So I hope you can see the screen as well. All right, so we're going to continue working through this. So now from numbers 30 to 39, we're going to have 51 to 70 because we have another 20 because it's double digits again. So that means that the 9 in 39 is my 70th digit. Does everyone understand the pattern that I've now recognized? So let me move on ahead actually a little because I've hit 70, right? So now I want to get from 71 to about 170. So I want 100 digits. And since they're all going to be double, I need to move 50 numbers. So we're going to go from 40, 50 numbers into the future, 89. Right? So this 89, the 9 in 89 is my 170th digit. Does everyone understand? Oh, sorry, I thought this was 173. This is 143. Let me backtrack a little. We're going to stop at 140. Sorry about that. So I'm actually doing 70 digits from 71 to 140, which means that I need 35 numbers. So if I'm doing 35 numbers, I'm going from 40 to 74. So 74, this 4 is my 140th digit. Is everyone with me so far? I had gone to 170 before because I thought this number said 173, but it actually goes up to 143, so I adjusted. I just want to make sure that's clear. Okay, wonderful. So now that I know that the 4 is the 140th digit, I can write the next few. So this 7 is 141, this 5 is 142, and this 7 in 76 is 143, which is the answer that I was looking for all along. But does everyone see how this problem was made into a smaller problem by me grouping things together, looking for patterns instead of writing out all the numbers? Does everyone understand? This is probably the most, prototypical Hunter question that usually stumps students. If you don't understand, please ask. I'm more than happy to stay on this problem for another 5 minutes. But if you do ask, please tell me where you got lost so I know exactly where to direct you to in terms of where we should be starting. Would it help if I just restarted from the beginning? Because that's also perfectly fine. Okay, so I see one person has asked, so I will restart from the beginning because they did not specify where they got stuck. Okay. So essentially the question is asking for the 143rd digit for these list of numbers. It starts off with 0, goes through 9, then 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, and so on until infinity. So the first thing I need to do is keep track. So I need to look out for my numbers. So from 0 to 9, these are all, so I'll call this type, right? These are all single digits. And there are 10 numbers here. So the last number, the 9, right? Last number, well, first let me figure out, so in this range, how many digits are there? So this is number of digits, and then this is digit place. So if I have 10 numbers that are each single digits, that means that there are 10 digits here, which means that the digit place, the 9's digit place is 10th. So far, so good. Are there any questions? Please ask as I go along. Okay. My next set of numbers that I'll group again by 10, so these are 10 numbers as well, is from 10 to 19. Well, these are all double digits. So that means that there are 20 digits I need to count. So 10 plus the 20, the 9 in 19 is the 30th place. So in 19, this 9 is the 30th digit. Any questions so far? If I do another 10, I'll go from 20 to 29. Again, these are 10 numbers. They're all double digits, so another 20 digits are added. That's how I get 50, right? Because I added 20 more digits to my 30th digit. So 29, that 9 is now my 50th digit in my count. Any questions? Okay, great. The last bit now is I stopped at 50, but I need to get to 143. So what I need to do is I need to add 90 more digits so that I can get to 140, right? If I'm adding 90 digits and they're all double digit numbers, right? That means that I need to add 45 more. So I need to add 45 more numbers. So if I start at 30, I'm going to go until 74 because 30 to 74 is 45 numbers, which means that the 4 in 74 is my 140th digit. And now I'm really close because I'm looking for my 143rd. So I can just move on and write ahead. The 7 in 75 is my 141st digit. The 5 in 75 is my 142nd. And the 7 in 76 is the 143rd digit that I was looking for through the problem. That's why the answer is 7. I hope this time around it was clearer. And if you have any questions, I'm sorry, but we have to move on. But I hope this made sense. I just want to be respectful of everyone's time, and I know we need to end at 9. Okay, wonderful. All right, so I'm going to move away from the math section, but this is a very prototypical Hunter question where a student can get this right, but then spend the entire test on just this one question, or a student can get this right and do it in about 2-3 minutes, right, and move on, right, to other questions on the test. All right, let me move on to the next page, because now we're going to talk about the Hunter essay. The Hunter essay is the make it or break it at the end, right? This is the last and the final deciding factor of what happens once the multiple choice is scored. I've written that the Hunter essay is really a personal narrative essay, and that there are 3 things that it must do. I wrote them down as 1, 2, 3, but they're really like a 1A, 1B, 1C, because they're all just as important. Okay, so I want to drive these 3 points home. The first thing is you answer the prompt. That's as simple as, can you follow directions? Oftentimes, students get caught up with all the other things we teach them, and they start doing that, but they never actually answer the prompt given, and that's what will cost them a seat at Hunter. If you do not answer the question being asked, if you're not following directions, you're not going to get into Hunter. It's as simple as that. Okay? The second thing, 1B, is showcase your ability as a writer, right? You want to show that you're organized, you're thoughtful, you're descriptive. Your goal is to keep the teachers engaged, right? You have good, clear, and nuanced transitions, right? Your transitions make sense, not just paragraph to paragraph, but sentence to sentence. One of the most frustrating things it can be as a reader is to read something and not understand how the writer got from point A to point B, right? So make sure that you're very clear in that as you write. Don't be repetitive. Use a varied sense of sentence structure and proper usage of higher vocabulary. Oftentimes, students are like, well, how many big vocab words do I need to use? Should I use 20? Should I use 15? Great, but don't use them, 1, wrong, and 2, unnecessarily, right? If things can be said simpler and they're better said simpler, use the simple word, right? Teachers can catch on really quickly when something sounds awkward because you're trying really hard to use a higher level vocabulary word. Use 3 or 5, but just use them correctly. That goes much further than you just using big words just for the sake of using big words. Now, this part's really important. Write about you, and this one's really hard for students to do. Writing about you is really difficult. Remember, there is no interview for Hunter and no external essay to turn in either. And this is very odd. You know, Hunter is paying for essentially 6 years of education that a lot of other parents are, taking their students out of private school to try and go for, right? I've known parents in the past who have had children go through Horace Mann for 6 years, paying like college level tuition to go to that private school. And the only reason they would ever pull them out is if they got into Hunter. That's very telling. So what this usually means is that the prompts are usually directed towards something personal, whether they make it clear or not. So in the past, some of the prompts have been, what is your most memorable family trip? Who is your everyday superhero? Or describe your best friend, right? So describe your best friend is, how is that personal? Well, by discussing who or what qualities your best friends possess that are appealing to you, the admissions team learns a lot more about you. I think someone had asked, is it okay to give background information? Remember, the Hunter essays are graded blindly. So they don't ever get the name, they just get an ID number for the student. So that's not, that shouldn't be any concern of like, should my child hide this fact or that fact? I would say authenticity is a very big portion of the test, right? That's why we tell students to write about things they know. Oftentimes students try to make things up because they don't feel like their lives are as interesting as little kids. I'm sure even for adults, it's hard to talk about ourselves. But as for kids, it must be even harder. The thing is, it's okay to embellish, but it has to be within the realm of reason. So let's be clear here. Yet none of us are as good writers as these fantasy writers who write these novels and captures people's, emotions and worlds and so on and so forth. So just write about what you know, because that's much easier and better to do. All right. So here are some good writing like tips that I've written down. Begin with a catchy hook, draw the reader in, have a clear answer to the prompt, and outline your essay. Right. So when I say outline your essay, kind of tell us what's coming up without telling us everything that is coming up. Separate events clearly into paragraphs. Beware of sentence structures, right? So write sentences that are clear and concise, but try for some sentence variety, right? If all of your sentences sound the same, that's not going to go well. Combine sentences that are short to avoid repeating yourself. Beware of word choice, right? Get rid of dead words that are not adding anything, but also only use words that you actually know the meaning of. Have a clear conclusion at the end, which should restate the words from the prompt and your essay as a whole. And bring back the hook to form a circle, right? Usually when you end the essay, just kind of bring it back. It's like tying a nice bow and wrapping it up. I got one question that says, should we include dialogue in your essay? I would say minimize, if not avoid dialogue. Right? I've heard students say like, right, when they talk and then write it down. That's what I would say is an example of a dead word, because I just got that question as well. Should you include dialogue in your essay? I would say avoid it. Dialogue does a lot of telling rather than showing. And the Hunter test has this mantra of show, don't tell, which is writing descriptively so that the reader feels like they're, in the story itself. So, some of the prompts I've shared with you have been direct prompts from the Hunter essay in the past. Citations and quotes are acceptable. Yes, they are, but I would say stay away from that as well. You're not writing a book report, you're writing about yourself. So there really shouldn't be too many quotes or citations happening. Of course, if the prompt literally asks for one, that's a different story entirely. I want to get to specifically one thing that I've been waiting to talk about before I take final questions in the last 5 minutes. So I'm going to talk for like another 5 and then I'll take final questions. Is the Hunter test, specifically the essay, is the hardest thing to teach. The reason why is because I can teach students a lot about how to write, and their writing skills will develop amazingly. But the hardest thing to have them get down is, remember that on test day, there won't be mom or dad behind them, me or Francis or any of the other tutors, telling them, hey, this is a good topic to write about versus this is a bad topic to write about. Because we don't know what the prompt is, right? So there is that moment of decision making that they need to make, right? My own brother, who I think is in some ways much more brilliant than I am in a lot of other things, did not make it into Hunter solely because, not because he was a bad writer, but because he picked the wrong thing to write about, right? And he thought he was going to do it because it was going to be quirky and different. But it's better to be safe and know something that you're going to write that you can write about and write well about it. So one of the prompts was write about a meaningful place in New York City, or a place that means a lot to you in New York City. And he wrote about the hospital where he was born. Now, at that point in time, he had only been in that hospital twice. So he didn't know it well enough to write about it descriptively or have such a big emotional connection to it. So that was the thing that kind of, I think, cost him admissions there. Back then they used to tell you what your breakdown of your test was, whether you got your essay read or not. But things have changed since then. They don't do any of that anymore. There's no appeals process to that. So I want to just go on to the next page here quickly to show you how they're still keeping us on our toes. So this was, after talking to some students, this was kind of like what we got was the essay prompt from last year. It was a visual story essay, but you'll notice, and I want to make this clear, that personal aspect has not disappeared. So you'll notice that there are 9 pictures here, and it says read the prompts below and answer each question in one paragraph. So they changed it up. Right? It's not 2 separate essays. Now it's just paragraph prompt responses. Using the pictures above, describe how one of the objects, one, not 2, not 3, not multiple, can be meaningful to the family in the picture below. So this was the family in the picture below. So someone wrote about this one and how it was meaningful because, for the little girl, it was her first piece of artwork. They hang it up. She remembers what her family's like. This is like her first big achievement. Her excitement going to school manifested, so on and so forth. Good answer for this one. Describe an object that is meaningful to you or your family. Someone wrote about a clock that's been in their house their entire lives. It was made by this old clockmaker whose store no longer exists in the city or shut down many years ago. But they remember their dad saying this was the first piece of furniture in this apartment, so on and so forth. And so this is like their parents' oldest belonging and the apartment's like oldest thing. So there, that's an example of someone answering both of these. And this is the personal aspect that has not disappeared, right? But you'll notice that these two things don't have to relate, right? They are separate prompts. Someone wrote something where they did relate it. They wrote about the same thing twice, essentially, right? How this was meaningful to this in a very fictional, creative way, and in a very real way, how it was meaningful to their family. So yeah, that's the other good point. For the second paragraph, should the object be from one of the pictures? And it doesn't have to be. And you'll notice that, right? Describe an object that is meaningful to you or your family. So they're using this to build off of that point. Good. So that was the last thing that I was going to say, is that it doesn't have to be one of these pictures from here at all. So this is what I mean by they're adding more of a creative twist on where the students have to do the decision making. And so, of course, like I have kind of a few tried and true methods to help students become better decision makers, because that's really what the Hunter test is going for now. And so, you know, those will be some of the things that they review in class if you all start the Kweller classes and whatnot. So those are the things to work on. This has just been, you know, a very brief overview of the test. I could spend 3 hours alone on just the reading section, right? Going through every single possibility that can show up. I could spend even longer on the math section, and of course, days on the writing section. So here's just some general tips, right? To use as you're taking practice tests. So, you know, mark up the test, write all over it, right? Don't be stingy with it. They're not going to recycle that test for next year. Answer questions on the test booklet, right? So oftentimes I find that circling them there also helps reinforce it when you bubble things in. Never leave an answer blank, right? There's no penalty for wrong answers. So please guess if you run out of time. Answer the easy questions first. Get as many of the cutoff points as you possibly can. Read the questions carefully. Some of them are out there trying to trick you, right? Look out for words like not and accept. Read all the answers. Even if it's not a process of elimination question, read all the answer choices so that you can go through each one and make sure that you didn't accidentally pick one that's true, but not answering the question above. Pace yourself. Timing is a very big issue, right, for a lot of students in the beginning. So make sure that that's clear and that you've practiced that. Ignore all distractions. I truly tell students all the time, you know, when you take a practice test, sometimes it's not a bad idea to go someplace where it's noisy on purpose, just to see how focused you can be regardless of your environment. I remember when I was studying for my MCAT, I went to the New York City Public Library every single morning, where I would help open the library with them, right, bright and early, and I would sit there, and there would be tourists that would come in, random people making noises, little kids, so on and so forth, and I would just, you know, go on through and take my test for 6.5, 7 hours straight. Relax, take a deep breath. I know that this is February 20th right now. The test is April 5th. It is not that far away. You have roughly about, 5 to 6 weeks until test day. Of course, we all wish Hunter would have given us more of a heads up. We all knew the test was coming, we just didn't know when. So some of you may have postponed your preparation for it. Well, now you know, right? So I would say that use the time wisely. I would always say the worst thing that a parent might feel, right, is always wondering what if, right? Being regretful of something. Like, oh, what if we didn't do this chess tournament for one of these weekends and instead focused on the Hunter test, right? Because I know for sure I can say that my life has turned out very differently because I went to Hunter. And I am very grateful for it, based off like my family background, so on and so forth, and what was affordable to us, and with the resources I was given at Hunter that I would probably never have been given at the local high school that, the local middle school that I went to. I will take on the final few questions now. How do you recommend dividing the 3 hours among the 3 sections of the test? Rule of thumb is usually about an hour per section. I think that's a nice way of doing it. If you find that a student is particularly strong in one section and they're able to both remain accurate and quick, then they can devote a bit more time on a section that they're weaker at. Will this recording be made available? I would like to hope so. Ms. Kweller and the other team at Francis and the other team at Kweller will probably handle the logistical side of that. Can they eat? Can they take a bathroom break? There's no such thing as bathroom breaks or eating breaks. They can definitely take breaks by raising their hand and asking to be excused. They can also, my word of advice to everyone is bring a snack to a test. If they say, no, you can't eat it, put it back in your bag. And when I say a snack, I usually mean like a protein bar or something, not like a sandwich or a 3-course meal or anything like that. Okay. Any other questions? Upon submission of application, is there a confirmed acceptance to take test communication sent, or is it a wait and see? I would like to assume that there is some period of wait and see before they return back your submission because they need to review it. Someone asked, how do you make the first paragraph relate to you? I don't understand what you mean by that. I assume you're talking about the essay, I guess. Well, the first one is not supposed to relate to you. But remember, you have to answer both the prompts. So I'm saying so that personal aspect doesn't disappear. Right? The first one isn't asking for a personal relation to you. It's just saying using the pictures above describe how one of the objects can be meaningful to the family in the picture above. That's all. So someone asked, I heard the Kweller tests were harder than the actual practice tests. Is that true? To a degree, some of them are definitely harder. We believe in making sure that if you're prepared for the worst case scenario, you'll be prepared for whatever scenario shows up in front of you. I also want to remind you all that there is a ton of material that Kweller has put together for the Hunter test. So even with the 5 to 6 weeks you have in front of you, that's not going to be ample time to get through every little bit of material, I'd say, right? So the material doesn't end by any means. So I'm sure there will be more than ample amount of material for you. Yes, the tests do tend to be a little bit more difficult than the actual test. Yeah. Okay, someone asked, my son went to a public school last year and took the state test. This year, he's enrolled in a private school. Would it be a problem for accessing the information of the state test? I don't see why it would be a problem to access that information. I don't think it will, but I can't speak to that right away. I'm not sure how the DOE works around that. I think the only problem I could potentially see is in accessing that information, your private school might not have any availability to help you in that procedure, but the Board of Education and the Department of Education should definitely be able to help you access that. Yeah. Okay, so I see it's 9 p.m. I'll answer this last question. Booklets can be marked on pencil or need to be in pen. I believe it's pencil only. So I will, I think that's the only thing that's allowed. You're not allowed highlighters, as far as I know, on the test, and markers. I guess this will be the last question I take. How do you recommend studying for the test during this upcoming 6 weeks? My big thing is don't be regretful. So remember, in the grand scheme of things, sixth grade is a blip, right, in their academic record. If for 6 weeks their attention diverges a little bit from school and into this bit of preparation, they should not fall behind. Remember that most students who are taking this test to begin with have school somewhat on cruise control, right? So devoting extra time, making sacrifices to other bits of extracurricular to pursue this so that you don't regret and ask yourself, oh, what if we had done something differently, right? Is, I think, the most important part through the procedure. In terms of studying for this test, I say a little bit every day for sure. And definitely a lot on the weekends or anytime you have a little bit of a break, like this week, for example. Thank you all for giving me your time, trusting Kweller with your child's education, which, as someone whose parents are immigrants, as an immigrant myself, I know education is the, step forward through social and financial mobility and independence. When a parent entrusts their child's education with us, I think of it as, entrusting us with their most valuable assets. So we don't take that lightly. Thank you all for, being so patient with me. going through all of this talk and putting up with me. I hope this has been helpful to each and all of you. I will hope your children all the best. Who knows, maybe for some of you, I may be working with you in the future. And, best of luck to all of you. All right. Have a great rest of your night and a great week ahead. Take care, y'all.